Hello and welcome to BASW England's Anti-Racism in Social Work presentation. My name is Liz Howard. I'm Professional Officer with BASW England. I'll hand over in a second to my colleague Wayne and to Pam, who's going to be delivering the presentation today. But firstly, we'd like to welcome you all to the presentation and say a big thank you to you all for coming along today. Wayne, if you'd like to introduce yourself next, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Liz, and welcome everybody. My name is Wayne Reid. I'm a professional officer, social worker, and anti-racism lead at BASW England, and I'm really pleased to be joining you today. And I'm going to hand over to Pam now.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Pam Shodeinde, and I'm a social worker, a newly qualified social worker, and also a member of the BASW BPS Group, which is the Black Professional Symposium, and also Vice Chair of the newly qualified social worker group.
Thank you very much, Pam.
I'm just going to take you very quickly through my slides. I'll just go to the next slide just to give you a bit of a background about who I am. I moved to the UK in 2002 as an international student. I came over to do a degree in law, an undergrad in law, and then went up to do a postgraduate in international human rights law. And that's sort of where I would say that my love for social work started, because I had the opportunity to volunteer for a few NGOs, and I was able to interact with some social workers, and that was where I sort of developed the love for going into social work practice. As I obviously progressed through that, I eventually went into youth offending as a mentor, and I did that for a number of years. And that was where I would say that I developed a lot of the skills and knowledge that I decided to actually progress my social work career in. I then went on to do a social work master's degree, and I qualified in 2020, and went and was employed by the Leicestershire County Council, where I'm currently just coming to the end of my ASYE, and it has been a really wonderful experience since I've been there. My relationship with BASW, at the moment, I'm a member of the BPS Group, which is the Black Professional Symposium Group. It's a group that was created, I think, on the back of Black Lives Matter movement, obviously after the death of George Floyd. Wayne created that group, and it's been a fantastic experience. I usually refer to myself as the baby of the group because I'm sort of like the social worker in that group with the least experience, but I don't get to feel that way at all. I've got lots of experienced social workers there. It's a fantastic initiative, and everyone there is really supportive. And we usually meet once every month to discuss issues around anti-racism and how we can develop ideas and innovations to push that agenda forward. I'm also the Vice Chair of the Student and Newly Qualified Social Work Group, which happened, I think, within the last couple of months or so. And again, that's been a fantastic initiative, working with students and, building ideas on how to progress social work, the social work agenda, and providing support for students throughout the social work education. I'll just go on to the next slide. So this slide says 2020, the year that caught the attention of the world. I mean, we all know that racism is something that has been within society for a very, very long time. So what was it about 2020 that made it so different, that sort of really projected that Black Lives Matter, how real racism was within society? And I said it took a pandemic to highlight the true picture of racial inequality. And the reason I say that is because we were forced to be in our homes because of this pandemic. Everyone was at home. Everyone had to stop what they were doing, their busy schedules, and we had to all watch that really dreadful situation happen in front of our TVs. And I think that really probably got everyone thinking about just how brutal racism is in society. It was a very distressing scene to watch when I still think about it. I've not really been able to watch the full clip because it was very emotive for me. It's, you know, it's very real that can happen in 2020. But then I think it just really highlights just how real this situation is. But then you then get responses such as, but Britain is not a racist nation. And that is something that, you know, a lot of people were saying after that Black Lives Matter movement started. But, you know, we're not a racist nation. We would never do that to anybody in the UK. But the reality is that it is happening right in front of our noses in the United Kingdom. And that is the reality. I've also said everyone has a voice. It is a system in place that either projects or limits how these voices are used in society. So there is a you know, systemic racism, which I think is actually quite predominant in the UK. And when I refer to systemic racism in the UK, is that the system is set up in such a way that it just excludes certain groups within society, where there's that sort of ordering and people kind of feel left out and not included within certain dynamics and the way that the system is set up. And so that's why I sort of refer to this as everyone having a voice. It's whether or not, you know, we're able to actually use that voice or not. And that's why the system is set up in such a way. And going back to the argument about Britain not being a racist nation. So why are we even talking about this? I think for us to be able to really understand what anti-racism is, we need to understand what is racism. So I found a quick definition, and it's basically stated: beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors, institutional and systemic approaches that belittle and devalue a group based on the color of their skin. This definition is actually a lot longer, but I thought for the sake of the presentation, I would just take a clips of this, which basically will be highlighting the argument as to why anti-racism is quite important in social work. So beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors, institutional and systemic approaches that belittle and devalue a group based on the color of their skin. And that's basically what racism is. Certain groups don't feel like they're part of the system because their beliefs, you know, the systemic approaches within institutions, within society, that just immediately prevents you from being able to move forward with certain things, especially in your career. So the next slide is anti-racism in social work and the importance of that. As a profession, I see social work, and the reason I decided to get into social work myself is I see social work as a career that should be promoting social justice for all, inclusion for all. And if as a profession we're not taking the forefront of promoting anti-racism, then it completely defeats what social work is about. And that's why I think that it is really important that social workers at the moment, even regulatory bodies as well, should be taking a firm stand on promoting anti-racism in social work. Right, so Black Lives Matter. Again, this is something that's existed for quite a long time, but I think that with obviously the events of 2020, there was a new sort of drive to really push this agenda forward. So what does Black Lives Matter actually mean? What does it stand for? Exactly what it means, Black Lives Matter. Black lives needing to matter more than they have. Society should value them equal to white lives, and does not. So what does that actually mean? It just means that Black lives matter just as much as white lives matter. And I think that when the movement started for Black Lives Matter, there was this new movement that started alongside that was arguing that, well, all lives matter. But then, you know, that is, for me, just driving a saw into an already open wound, because we're not arguing that white lives or other lives don't matter. We're only saying that our lives matter just, you know, just as much as everyone else. and that we would need to have the same opportunities that is afforded to everybody else on the same level. We want to feel included, we want to feel like we're equal to everybody else, and we don't want to feel this, automatic barrier that is usually put in place for us. And that's, basically the premise of what Black Lives Matter is about. There is obviously criticism about Black Lives Matter and what it stands for, if it's a political movement, but it's very interesting because, I'm very unclear as to why a movement that promotes equality is demonized by some people who vehemently claim that, they're not racist and advocate for freedom of speech. It's a movement that only is looking to progress and give everybody the same opportunity. And that's just saying that Black Lives Matter just as much as everybody else's lives matter. I do really like this, the 4 dimensions of racism, because it helps to deconstruct what racism is about and how it actually does take place in the world that we live in today. So this is now sort of been deconstructed into 4 different aspects. There's institutional racism, and this is where you find the policies and practices that reinforces racism standards within a workplace or an organization. There's also the structural racism, which is the multiple institutions collectively upholding racist policies and practices within society. Then we come to the interpersonal racism, and this is where you find that the institutional and structural, this is where it informs the interpersonal, because if you find that there's a system in place that actually reinforces what you feel you can get away with, then you'll keep doing them. And that's what interpersonal is. Racist acts and microaggressions carried out from one person to another. And then we come to the internalized, the subtle and overt messages that reinforces negative beliefs and self-hatred in individuals. So those are the things within society that you find where sort of like, stereotyping what Black people actually are and how it's just how they are. This is, Black people are criminals, Black people have come to our country to take our jobs. And then you find those sort of rhetorics, that sort of internalize this subtle and overt messages and beliefs, that then allows people to be able to carry out going back to the interpersonal, to carry out the racist acts and microaggressions from one person to another. So we have talked a lot about what racism is, and obviously for us to be able to understand what anti-racism is, I hope that with obviously what we've talked about, you now have a basic understanding of what racism is. I do really like the work of Ibram Kendi, who has really done a lot of work around anti-racism and the need for this agenda to be pushed forward. And he has given a really, really concise definition of what anti-racism is. And his definition is, it is a belief that all races and ethnic groups are equal and deserving of the same opportunities. But the most important part of anti-racism is the next step, which is to do something about the existing inequality. Anti-racism is active dismantling of systems, privileges, and everyday practices that reinforces and normalizes the contemporary dimensions of white dominance. This, of course, also involves a critical understanding of the history of whiteness. But I think for me, it's really important to understand the history of whiteness, because when you understand the history of whiteness, then you understand how the system actually promotes white privilege in society, because that way it helps you to reflect on your own biases and why the system automatically excludes certain groups. And one of the ways that I think about this is that the way that the system is set up is really based on white values, white norms, Eurocentric values and norms within society, where the box is strictly difficult if you're not within that cultural, or if you don't understand the way the system works, you find it really difficult to fit in. And that's sort of what promotes racism within society. Something else that he has said, which I think is quite important to highlight, is what's the problem with being not racist? So it's a question that he's asked there. It is a claim that signifies neutrality. I am not a racist, but neither am I aggressively against racism. So that's obviously reinforcing that neutrality. But there's no neutrality in the racism struggle. So you're either on one side or on the other. You can't sit on the fence. The opposite of racist isn't not racist, it is anti-racist. So there's no such thing as saying, oh, I'm not a racist. You're either a racist or you're an anti-racist. So it's, very important to pick a side. What would you say about that, Wayne and Liz? Do you agree?
Totally, yeah. From my point of view, I like the additional Ibram X. Kendi quote that you have to the right there. The fact there is no, sometimes people think that not being racist is the kind of sort of best case scenario, really, in many ways. And actually, as you've pointed out, it isn't. That because of the way that society is structured, because of the institutions we have, their histories and the way that they operate, etc. We have to be actively and proactively anti-racist in order to combat that wide-ranging racism. So I totally agree with that. What are your thoughts, Liz?
Yeah, thanks, Pam and Wayne. Absolutely. And I think I just wanted to pick up on, when you were talking about the history of whiteness and the fact that someone who's striving to be an ally, which I'm striving to be, that's a whole series of education that I need to make sure that I both do personally, but also in my role as social worker, because as you've rightly pointed out, there isn't a neutral ground here. Professionally, we are bound to be challenging racism. That's what we sign up to when we become a social worker, as you were saying before, that the whole principle of social justice, that's what we're doing here. That's our business. So if that is our business, we really need to be signed up to understanding our history and being able to face up to what that involves, what that entails, and be ready to kind of take that on and not be passive and not be in this territory of, well, I'll let that go, or I'm not going to challenge this. It is about that understanding and being able to back up why we're challenging things and why that is so important, because that's the only thing that's going to move us forward. So I really appreciate the extra kind of definition here to help us to kind of get to grips with, we're not messing about here, you one or the other. There is no fence sitting. So thanks for that, Pam.
Yeah, thanks very much, both. Yeah, I just thought it was really important to be able to highlight that, because there is a lot of, at the moment, a lot of people that would sort of identify more with the I'm not a racist, and, I've never said anything racist to anybody, or I've never done anything racist, I'm nice to everyone, I've got black friends, and you get a lot of people that would say that, I work with black people all the time and I've never made anyone feel uncomfortable about their race. But what are you personally doing to be able to ensure that even if you aren't the one who's actually perpetrating the racism, what are you doing to ensure that it isn't being done to the person next to you who's black or who's a minority ethnic person? So I thought that was quite interesting.
Excellent.
So just go on to the next slide, which says, how much of a priority is anti-racism in social work? As I said earlier on, it's, in fact, it should be one of the forefronts of social work practice at the moment. It is so important that social work practice should be reinforcing the need for anti-racism to be embedded within social work education and social work regulations, and we don't seem to find that at the moment. That's not happening. And then we ask ourselves, why isn't that happening? Why is this? We have identified, and there has been a lot of conversations that has been happening all of last year, even this year. We're still having, we're doing this. This is obviously one of the many conversations that we're having about anti-racism, but you still find that there's still a lack of urgency to really address the situation, and then we then wonder why. What is it exactly that isn't clear to see? That there are people within society who are, even be it social workers or even people that we work with, service users, that really need this agenda to be pushed forward. It's not that, if the anti-racism agenda is being pushed forward, some, people who currently benefit from white privilege, that's still not going to take away that privilege. That's still, that it is what it is. What we're saying is that this is really parity, as certain groups are feeling excluded within society, and that isn't acceptable. And as a profession that should be progressing these sort of conversations forward, I personally feel that enough isn't currently being done. And so this slide just basically reinforces that. And it just talks about anti-racism in social work must be fully considered and dismantled through collaborations with Black and ethnic minority social workers in roles as experts with personal and professional lived experiences. For me personally, I identify with that more from a lived experience perspective. I've only just started my social work career, but I do know that I have had really bad experiences of racism within my career already, and those sort of feelings, are very unsettling, because you're coming into a career that you feel, you should be feeling quite confident as a social worker that, I'm within a career or profession that I feel protected, because I know that people would understand and want to push this agenda forward. But unfortunately, that wasn't my case. But one of the things I think is really important to highlight as well is that the onus isn't only on Black people to be able to really understand what racism is. Yes, I'm an expert based on lived experience, but also I don't have all the solutions to how we can move this forward. And I think that's why it's very important that we need to do this as a collective group, as people coming together from all walks of life, to be able to ensure that within society, anti-racism is being pushed forward. On the second paragraph, I think it's something else that I think is really important to mention, is that when social workers have a positive experience of anti-racism, then it makes them more confident to work with their service users, and everyone has a positive experience. You will find that even within when there's a lack of cultural competence, and I know cultural competence is something that is a whole nother conversation to have, but I just thought I'd just highlight it there. Reason I am doing that is because when you don't understand the lived experiences of people, then you don't know how to support them. I was reading a study recently that said that in terms of referral to services of support, you find that more white families are being referred for support than Black families. And what then tends to happen is that Black families tend to be found that they need that support, but mainly at crisis intervention, which they might have been able to, that those gaps could have been identified at an earlier point. Earlier services could have gone in to support those families, those children, and it could have had a much better outcome. So yeah, just that was a good example to highlight there.
Pam, that is a really good example. I just wanted to say something on that, actually, just about that kind of the access to services, and thinking what you were saying before about, the structural systems that we've got in place that exclude people, and around the fact that, as social workers, we need to be alert to that.
Yeah.
What is the reason here that we're not getting in to see Black and minority ethnic families early enough? What are we doing about that as social workers, I think, is the question that we need to be asking ourselves in response to that research. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
And Pam, would you mind just going back a slide, please?
Yeah.
Just to that last slide. Just because I think the image there is also very powerful as well, and communicates some of the barriers that are in place, for people of colour, both personally and professionally. I know that's kind of like a professional example there, but I think it just illustrates really some of the the barriers that we face, and quite often there is a lack of empathy sometimes from peers, colleagues, managers, etc., which I think that image captures really quite powerfully.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So in order for us to fully understand what white privilege is, I think this is a very powerful way of illustrating that. So this is basically highlighted this in 4 different dimensions. It talks about white supremacy, white indifference, white awareness, and white allyship. And again, it's really about moving from one to the other. Talking about anti-racism is actually a very uncomfortable conversation to have. More, believe it or not, for Black people, as much as it is difficult for white people as well. But it's also understanding your privilege as a white person and the power that you hold, and just how important it is to be able to understand your position and use that in a positive way to promote these, outcomes for everyone that should be inclusion for everybody and equality for everybody. So just going through white supremacy, it is basically the premise that, you don't see beyond yourself, everything, you understand that you've got that privilege and you use it to your advantage, and it's basically all about you. You don't really care what the experiences of Black people are because it doesn't affect you, and if possible you would use your white privilege to get ahead without caring how it affects other people of color. White indifference, I would say, very much reflects what we talked about earlier on about, oh, I'm not a racist. So these are people that, again, don't really identify with Black people or people of minority ethnicity because, yes, I don't particularly do anything racist, but I'm not really bothered about your lived experiences. And sort of this is where I'd say people in that sort of white indifference, that's the category I would say that they fall into. Then we come to white awareness. Again, I think this is the category of people who are beginning to actually really understand the position and how it actually affects the people around them. Understanding that you've got the privilege and, really wanting to reflect on how you could perhaps move to the dimension of white allyship. Because obviously, for you to be able to become a white ally, you need to be able to recognize that you've got that privilege and how best you can use that to move into the white allyship category. Would you agree, Wayne? Do you think I've explained this well?
I do, Pam. Yeah, I think the beauty of that infographic is that it's subjectivity to some degree, in that I think it applies at the individual or kind of micro level, but also at the kind of macro and organizational level as well. So I think that, people and organizations and groups can kind of chart their thinking around race issues based on those different types of white identity.
That's absolutely right, yeah.
And the last bullet point for each column, I think, just sums up where people are in terms of their mentality as well on that. So again, I really like that infographic.
Yeah, I think it captures it really well in trying to identify the different categories and sort of get people to reflect on where they are and how they will be recognizing the white privilege in society. I think it's really important.
Can I just ask, sorry Liz, I was just going to say, from an ally perspective, from your point of view, how effective or worthwhile, is that infographic for you, would you say? Would you mind going back, Pam, please? Just one.
Yeah, thanks, Pam. Yeah, I was just going to ask if I could come in then, because for me, I think this is really effective, because I think potentially when people look at this, certainly from a white perspective, this is potentially the first time someone would have been confronted with this kind of information in this kind of way. And I think it's got real impact because it lays it out bare. There's nowhere to hide with that. And you talked about feeling uncomfortable, and talking about racism, it is uncomfortable. It is completely uncomfortable, and as it should be. because of all the things that it perpetuates. And actually this, I feel, on a personal level and also professional level, is a really, it really helps you to kind of critically reflect, well, where actually am I here? I know where I think I am, and I know where I'd like to be, and I know how I want other people to see where I am, but where actually am I? And one of the things I think is really interesting about this is that actually you could be in all four of those categories all at the same time, or in relation to a different set of actions that you might have carried out or not carried out, or situations that you might be in. So actually it's very fluid. And although for me, you know, in my kind of journey into allyship, I want to be obviously moving over towards the white allyship here and demonstrating through my actions and everything that I do that this is where I'm at. I also know that there are examples in my career and in my life where I've been here, and that's very important to acknowledge and also be accountable for, because becoming an ally is a whole learning journey. It's not a point that we reach and we stop there. And this really kind of, I think, reinforces that point, that there is always learning, and we can use this to keep ourselves in check, and other people can use this, as Wayne was saying, not just at the personal level, but the team, and thinking about students, and thinking about newly qualified social workers such as yourself, Pam, and that kind of critical reflection and learning, and organisations, and it can be used to hold people to account. And I think that it's a really, really helpful way of bringing those uncomfortable conversations to the fore. So thank you for that. I really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Liz, for that. I mean, something I would say which might be really helpful is to challenge the stereotypes that you have about certain groups of people, Black people, or, you know, Black minority and ethnicity, because we as human beings are conditioned to think in a certain way because of the society that we live in, and the sort of things that feed through the lens that we you know, sort of communicate, and our thought processes. So I think it's really important to be able to challenge those thoughts, you know, where if you find somebody, you know, a typical example would be you see a Black person in the middle of the night in a hoodie and you cross the road to the other side of the road, you know, why are you doing that? Because again, it's that portrayal of what a Black male would, you know, in a hoodie is sort of demonstrating someone who's dangerous, someone who could attack you. And that's why, you know, because I personally, to be honest, you know, even as a Black woman, I tend to, you know, to do that as well, where I would say, oh gosh, I've seen, because again, it's how society has portrayed those people. And I kind of just think that if we get to a point where we're challenging those stereotypes and biases, then we could eventually get to a point where we could have these conversations without feeling uncomfortable.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
If I could just make the point as well, Pam, just on that last infographic,
Yeah.
I know you want to move on, but just very quickly, that some of the indicators, I think, on that infographic, behind each one, you know, there's almost like a world behind each bullet point, I think, there, you know, to kind of unpick for each identity as well. And one that particularly jumps out for me, I mean, it is subjective, I think, for different people looking at this, but one that jumps out for me is under white indifference, where it says willing to tolerate, fetishize, and pity the non-white. You know, just that as a concept in of itself, I think, is very relevant to modern society, really, both personally and professionally. But, you know, so are many others. But yeah, it's a really good infographic, that one.
It is really, really good. Yeah. So talking about workplace racism, I mean, it's a very important point to really think about when trying to understand systemic racism, because you would find that a lot of managers, senior management would tell you, well, again, going back to, well, I'm not racist, I'm not a racist. We've got a lot of, we've got a diverse team. You hear that a lot, we've got a diverse team. But again, question is, yes, you do. But if we then think about senior management level, what percentage of Black or ethnic minorities actually represents the true reflection of the workforce within your diverse team? And that's something that, you know, again, a point of reflection for senior management to think about. So just quickly going through this, it says the covert, entrenched, and everyday racism in the workplace sometimes indicate the lack of quality, cultural diversity, and multicultural education and training available to all staff. Surprisingly, it is rarely acknowledged in social work that race is simply a socially constructed idea with no scientific validity, invented and refined principally to oppress people of color. This has modern and everyday ramifications in the working environment. And one of the, sometimes I think it's always good to use everyday experiences of social work, because what I've personally experienced, you might find service users might decide not to interact with you just purely based on the color of your skin or how you speak. I've been in a meeting where another social worker was told, well, I don't understand what you're saying, and everybody in that meeting could hear perfectly well what that social worker was saying, but because she obviously didn't have a sort of Eurocentric accent, that sort of, already just, made it clear where that sort of the premise of what that statement was trying to say. So again, it's really, when there is a cohesive, collective approach on tackling the issues of racism in the workplace, then you find that a lot of these issues become more minimized, because people of color feel more confident to be able to raise these issues at work and not sort of just go, well, yeah, it's a 9-to-5 job, because it really isn't. Social work is not a 9-to-5 job. We are sort of still working even after our laptops have been closed. So I think it's really important that racism in the workplace should be tackled, and I think it needs to be tackled institutionally and also at a regulatory level as well, because if the Social Work England, who's a regulatory body, can have a statement which is very clear on their position on anti-racism, I think that would sort of feed into organisations and social work education organisations as well, universities, that is.
Pam, can I just come in on that as well? Because I was just thinking then about social work education, and we've talked a lot about, the kind of regulatory role there as well. I'm also thinking for someone like myself, I've been a social worker for 20 years, so I'm into the post-qualification landscape, if you like, as well, and around, what our responsibilities there as a profession are in terms of where does anti-racism fit with our ongoing learning and development as professionals. And just thinking about that comment you've just made there about we're still working well after the time our laptops have closed, absolutely, and we're still striving to be anti-racist well after the time our laptops close. So I suppose it's just a comment really, just thinking about we focus on qualifying education for social work, but actually a lot of us have been in the profession for a long time, and what's happening around us educating ourselves, or that kind of educational landscape for us. So it's just a comment really, I think.
Yeah, and it's a really good comment as well, but I think also there's a huge question in that, and I think that it's about the view that people think and the importance they put to this. How important is it to you that this agenda is actually pushed forward? Do you see it as something that if it doesn't affect you? And I think the reality is that a lot of people just don't identify with why this is important, because if they do, then we wouldn't be needing to have these conversations. I think where we would be now is, how do we come together? And I don't think we're at that point yet. I think we're still sort of shouting and saying, well, this is important. I think that discussion should have moved to the point where, what are the solutions that we need to be having? What conversations should we be having? What can we put in place to really tackle these issues? And I don't think we're quite there yet.
No, thanks.
That's a really good point, that though, as well. And I like what you were saying there, Liz, about post-qualification. I hear what Pam is saying about solutions, and it being, very kind of late, really, I guess, this resurgence in anti-racism, because anti-racism has been within social work for many years, and the infographic we were looking at previously, created by Gurnham Singh, he's one of the pioneers of anti-racism in social work, and has been doing that for years. So, you know, I think really what that indicates and highlights is the level of resistance, you know, for pioneers of anti-racism in years gone by. But also in terms of the post-qualifying kind of requirements, I think it's a really good point that Liz makes. I mean, I've written quite a bit about how I feel the professional and education and training standards should incorporate anti-racism, but also anti-discriminatory and anti-oppressive practice. But Liz is really quite right as well in terms of post-qualifying. You know, where is that embedded in ASYE? You know, to my knowledge, it isn't. Where is anti-racism and the other values and ethics embedded in people's employment contracts, for example? So they're not just signing up to say, yeah, I'll do that job, but they're saying I'll do it in this particular way, you know. So I think it's really kind of, there's lots to go at. It's really just, as you put on one of the previous slides, how much of a priority is it for, you know, organisations and leaders, really?
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
And for us as a profession, I think that's the point, isn't it? And you were saying, Pam, about, you know, where are the solutions? It's like, well, why aren't we as a profession coming up with these solutions and championing that? And that is the question that we should be all asking ourselves, I think. Yeah,
absolutely. And you find that there have been quite a number of meetings and organisations are having these you know, requests for anti-racist training or requests for anti-racist presentations. And I know that BASW has done a number of those. You do get quite a lot of requests at the moment, obviously following off the 2020 events. But actually what has changed, even with the number of meetings and the number of presentations, that, you know, what nothing has changed. And again, that is quite telling in itself, that we're having the conversations, but there seems to be, no, we're not as far as we were in 2020. We're still dealing with the same issues in the workplace just as we were before. It's just that now they're quite more projected because we're having the conversations more.
Yeah.
So key responsibilities. So it is imperative that social workers evaluate their role morally and regulatory responsibilities. Current race relations require social workers to be proactive and do our homework to stay contemporarily astute as allies to Black and ethnic minority colleagues and service users. And I think that's a really, really important point. It goes back to what you were talking about, Liz, is that as social workers, how do we inform ourselves? Because I think it's, and being an anti-racist is not a one-stop job. It's not, you know, one presentation. It's something that's an ongoing, you know, it's something that you have to keep educating yourself, because it is not, you know, it's not, oh, I know all I need to know now, then that way I'm able to identify the needs of people I work with. No, it's not that. It's that you're actively educating yourselves. You're actively speaking to people about their lived experiences, because it's not your reality, it's not what you have to deal with every day. So for you to be able to have an understanding, you have to be open to having those uncomfortable conversations. And that's where, you know, coming back to our roles as social workers, this is so important that we're able to have that at the back of our minds when we're actually dealing with colleagues at work, you know, who aren't white, because it is easier to actually relate to people who look like you. That is scientific evidence to back that up. But, you know, we live in a society that's very diverse and we all have to relate somehow. So how do we actually come to a place where we can tolerate each other, you know, and we can live together in a society where I don't have to worry about the fact that I'm Black, because I think that will be a barrier. So really important for social workers to be able to think about that. And, you know, the next point is Black and ethnic minority social workers cannot and should not be expected to fix the racism in the workplace. And I can say that this is actually the approach that a lot of organizations are taking at the moment. You find that you get more questions being asked to, you know, you might be in a meeting, and when the issue of racism comes up, you expect the Black worker to be the one who's actually answering the question. What have you done as a white person to actually go and do your research, to be able to have a constructive conversation with me about my lived experiences? And so is that the onus is on me to be able to explain to you, but sometimes it's not even easy for me, because it's like having to relieve what I've already been through. And probably don't want to do that. You know, it's not very easy for everybody. We're not all as resilient to be able to go through that. So, you know, it's not particularly fair, but it is the reality, and it is what is going on at the moment.
Pam, just picking up on that, I just want to, again, when you've just been talking about that sort of conversation at work and, you know, being put on the spot, and then it's all back to locating everything with the individual again, isn't it? The individual's expected to explain absolutely everything about racism to a whole room full of people. And this is the whole issue about white privilege that you know, you're kind of exploring earlier about. As a white person, as someone that's trying to understand racism and trying to be an ally, I want to be alert to all of that privilege and the way that manifests itself. And that's a prime example that you've just described there about how it's manifested, that entitlement for a white person to ask you to share your experiences in that way and expect you just to be open to that's just a classic example of it. And that's the, you know, that is the kind of detail, the dismantling that is required, that awareness, being alert to all of that, and actually, you know, approaching that in the way that it should be approached, you know, and really thinking about the fact that it's not just on you as a black person or any black person to be talking about racism. Why aren't we as white people raising those issues and having that conversation? So yeah, thank you Pam for that.
A point I think I would just quickly make on that, just following on from Liz's, I think perhaps there's a variety of reasons why that doesn't happen. Some of it is possibly, you know, around sort of white fragility, around white privilege, as Liz has talked about, and various other kind of concepts and sort of mind states that people have. But I think ultimately it comes back to education, really, and how willing people are to be educated on this stuff, how much that's prioritized, and I guess the quality of the education as well that they're getting. So there's a few variables around that, but I think it all comes back to education, really. And as social workers, you know, as we've already alluded to, we sign up for CPD once we qualify and we're registered. And so really it's about that system that's in place in terms of, as we've said before, kind of, you know, the standards and so on, but also maybe in terms of actually the regulatory registration process, that needs to be more explicit about anti-racism and anti-oppressive and anti-discriminatory practice. So we build these things into the system, because I think what we realise is that without that explicit mention, without those explicit requirements, it just doesn't happen.
No.
Yeah.
It's an excuse then for it not to happen, actually, isn't it? The absence excuses it.
Yeah. It's an excuse, and at the same time, it's leaving it open to interpretation by different organizations. So obviously one organization might be more proactive than the other, because obviously we all interpret anti-racism how best that we think fits into our everyday roles. So going off what Wayne was saying there about what the barriers are. So obviously we've just led quite beautifully into the next slide. So barriers to meaningful organizational change. So before any meaningful change can be achieved, social work educators and employers must acknowledge the inherent and intrinsic nature of whiteness, white fragility, white privilege, and white supremacy as unconscious bias in most, if not all, institutions, structures, and organizational cultures. Individual and organizational awareness is an imperative first step for social workers, social work employers, and social work educators to address workplace racism effectively. And I think a really good example of that is that I don't think there's been any inquiry as to why there is more, you get more Black or people of color who are referred to disciplinary action compared to white people. And yes, we do know that the figures are there. It's very obvious, everyone can see it, but I don't think that there's been actually any need to investigate this, because the outcome, even though it is talked about quite a lot, the outcome is still very there for a lot of Black people, Black social work students and Black social workers who are losing their pins, or some students would have paid thousands of pounds. And then, you know, sometimes there are stories, horror stories of students who get to the 100-day placement and being told on the 99th day that, you know, we're really sorry, you can't continue because we've got concerns about your practice. I mean, I've been at your organization for, you know, up until that point, you've never raised any issues. And right at the end of this, you're telling me now that I've got to, you know, you've got concerns about my practice. But again, it's really thinking and trying to unearth why do we have why do these structures, why aren't we actually dismantling this? Why aren't we questioning these organizations? And I think for me, the very clear answer to that is the regulatory body. I think it starts from there, because if there is a really firm sort of coherent understanding of what anti-racism coming from the regulatory body, then automatically feeds into social work organizations and social work educational institutions where they would have to adopt that. But at the moment, it's very open to interpretation. So everyone kind of just does what, you know, isn't, you know, whatever they want to, really.
I think, Pam, on that as well, it's almost like you need to kind of reverse it. So I'm thinking about students on placement. It's like, what assurances are students going to have about how, you know, how that organisation or that placement or that practice educator is looking at anti-racism? Where's the assurance for people before that arrangement even starts? Because the situation you've just described there's all manner of things gone wrong leading up to that point. If that's been the outcome for the student, that they've had that information given to them at that point in time, then there's a whole host of other things that should have been done way before all of that to ensure that that placement provides the student, the Black student, with a positive experience, like you were talking about before, about a positive experience. So again, thinking about all the structures, there's so many different layers, aren't there, involved in social work education, and employers are absolutely key, but also how those arrangements are set up from the start is absolutely key as well around anti-racism.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah,
that's a really good point. Yeah, and you know, again, I think Liz has alluded to this already, that I think sometimes we become a bit sort of fixated on the interpersonal kind of racism, which of course is important, but I do think it kind of detracts away from looking at systemic issues, procedural issues that actually perpetuate racism on a bigger scale, you know, in their own way. I think that's some of the stuff that we need to look at within social work, and more broadly, you know, as a society. But just looking at what's within our control, I think, you know, we need some real kind of system change at that level, really.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, another example quickly, just back of what you just said, Wayne, is the response to the NHS response to Black and ethnic minorities doctors and nurses during the initial COVID lockdown, and why we were seeing such a high number of deaths and, you know, people that were being affected by COVID. And one of the very, very interesting, I've got a friend who's a nurse who said to me at work where she will a lot of the nurses, the white doctors and nurses, were refusing to take on certain tasks because, you know, they could say and not, you know, they were quite sure nothing would happen, but Black staff were quite afraid to do that. So, you know, they would then have to cover those shifts or cover those tasks, and that's one of the reasons. I mean, I know that there's a lot more, but it's just an example that I thought I was
interesting.
Okay, so this is basically just, again, looking at the 3 typical organizational responses when attempting to tackle racial inequality. So the 3, and I think more from an organizational perspective. So a lot of organizations might obviously keep quiet, keep things the same, and hope all of this Black Lives Matter stuff just goes away. I mean, it's just so much easier, isn't it? You know, we don't like having this conversation. It's not very nice, isn't it? And, you know, eventually it would just go away. So then we can go back to status quo. And, you know, this kind of inaction is a real paralysis. It really does, you know, reinforces, you know, the perception of white fragility, white privilege, and white supremacy for people of color. Because I know that when this whole movement started again back sort of mid last year, there was a lot of hope for, you know, a lot of Black social workers that, oh, you know, hopefully now something is going to be done about this. But here we are, sort of few months, you know, not a few months, nearly a year down the line, and we're still, you know, nothing's been done. So people have just gone back into their shells, because yeah, that's the approach that's been taken by quite a lot of organizations. Then we come down to the very tokenistic, you know, we have to be seen that we're doing something. We can't be quiet, you know, jump on the bandwagon. Like I said before, there has been a lot of requests for anti-racist presentation from organizations, but again, nothing has changed. So you would get them making statements and kind of just, you know, reinventing the wheel. Yeah, let's do some training. What can we do? What can we put in place? But sort of like a year down the line, everything goes back to how it used to be. And then you have a real authentic anti-racism action plan that sort of really highlights very smart measures like Wayne has put there. So the specific, measurable, achievable, and realistic targets. And I think that's really where organizations need to be now. I'm sort of made an example earlier on. I think this is in here as well. So for example, publishing a strong mission position statement condemning George Floyd's murder and racism in all its forms, and committing to BASW Code of Ethics, anti-oppressive, anti-discriminatory, and anti-racist practice. This approach interlinks with the anti-racist commitment framework below. I just wanted to say, make a point on that in terms of where I currently work. So I'm currently with Leicestershire County Council, and within the Children and Family Service, there has been, I would say that we're sort of in the third domain, because our Director of Service has taken a very firm approach to addressing a lot of the issues around racism in the workplace, one of which has been really saying it as it is. So we now have a race inclusion board. So it's not like an anti-discriminatory, you know, it is saying, look, we've got a race inclusion board. And I think that's really important. But within that, it's not only just Black member of staff that actually attend that, it's actually quite open to everybody, anyone who's actually interested in wanting to push this agenda forward. We also have race champions, which is something that has never happened in the service before. So we have race champions within all of the services all of the children and family services. And a lot of senior management now are sort of asking questions, and I want to believe that it's coming from a genuine place. And also, and I think very important, there has been an inquiry as to progression of people of colour within Leicestershire County Council and how that needs to be addressed. And I think that's really important because, again, you find that within senior management, there isn't that many Black and ethnic minorities, and that really is very telling because it doesn't fully represent the diversity of the workforce. So I think that's sort of the position that I feel. I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done, don't get me wrong. We're still at the very early stages of this, and I'm just hoping that we don't go back to the number 2. But from the, you know, coming from the director, I think it's really important that these agendas are being discussed, and all the senior management staff are sort of on board with this as well, which is really important.
If I could just come in briefly, Pam, just to say that completely take your point about the kind of slow progress that's been made within social work. And, you know, there is some green shoots to be pleased about, I think, certainly ones that I've been made aware of over the last several months. But there's also some, you know, some real inaction, some real silence from key organisations as well, which is, you know, disappointing, and we will continue to do what we can to hopefully encourage those organisations and colleagues to get more actively involved. But just to make the point that kind of activity that I'm planning on getting involved in soon, or kind of leading, is on collating a lot of the work streams and activities that have taken place around the country over the last few months, or last several months, following George Floyd's murder, to kind of sort of create a sort of clear picture, I guess, as to what activities and innovations have taken place during that time frame, and to share that with the profession, possibly in an article or a webinar. I'm not entirely thought that far ahead yet, but I think it would be just important to do a sort of stock take, really. And I think by its very nature, that will hopefully promote some accountability as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just on that as well, I building on what you've just said there, Wayne, it is about that kind of, and I think coming on to some of the things that may be on this slide as well, Pam, it is about that accountability. So you've described there, a set of actions that have been put in motion in your place of employment, and it'll be interesting to see, who gets involved in that, how long those things continue, and how how senior leaders are held to account on what's going on within the organisation and what their commitment is. And I think that's the kind of tipping point that we're at the moment, isn't it? Is understanding, are these plans, gestures, how are they translating into action, and what impact is that having? What difference are those actions making to the experience of Black and minority ethnic staff in organisations and in social work as well? Because as you rightly described earlier, a positive experience around anti-racism then translates into a positive experience with people and families and communities that we're working with as social workers. So that it's got the potential to have huge impact if the plans are stuck to, and if the buy-in is there and it's serious, and we're serious about anti-racism. So I just wanted to point that out, really.
I think this basically encompasses a lot of what we've already talked about, but it's just being mindful of time. It's just a really good framework that organisations should be looking to adopt in terms of adopting an anti-racist or being an anti-racist organisation. And it just talks about, very quickly, accelerating diversity within. So again, I think I would put this down to how progression and sort of breaking the glass ceiling, which is something that Wayne talks about quite a lot, because it is a huge problem within organizations, because you find that again, it's probably a confidence thing, but again, it's a confidence thing based on lived experiences, where people get to a certain point and just feel, I'm not going to bother applying for that role because I'm not going to get it. And so it's really about increasing the confidence of everybody. It's about having a representative panel when, recruiting people at all levels, and ensuring that, there's that fairness in making those decisions about who gets a role and who progresses. And it's not just left to the same people who are making the same decisions, because then what you tend to find is that you just keep employing the same people within those roles, and then certain people don't get to progress.
Yeah, there's that phrase about recruiting in your own image, isn't it? It's that kind of like, yeah,
absolutely. Okay. So educating, empowering, and equipping people. So again, putting in those trainings and making it mandatory, because actually that's really important. You find that a lot of training is not mandatory, or even if it's mandatory, it's not monitored to see who, are people actually doing this training. So it's really important that those sort of trainings are made mandatory for everybody, so to understand the issues. Leading by example. So again, every senior leader will commit to have reverse mentoring. Yeah, this is something that we're currently doing as well. Most senior, I believe that most senior management are currently now looking at reverse mentoring, just again to have an understanding of issues of racism. Building transparency. So again, it's about audits and making it clean as to how decisions are made and how they impact all members of staff of the organisation. So how do you become anti-racist? I think we have covered a lot of this already, but again, just going back to the need to have conversations, because I think the more that we talk about it, the more that we leave the fear zone into the growth zone. It's not a very comfortable conversation, and that, I've said that quite a number of times already, but when people are open to be vulnerable, if I'm vulnerable to be able to share my experience, you should be vulnerable enough, open enough to be able to receive what I'm saying to you without that bias. And it's about not seeing yourself as, going back to white fragility, oh gosh, it's not my problem, I don't need to know about this, I've not done anything wrong. Again, we've talked about this, what needs to happen at a national level. So there has to be, regulatory bodies have to now be looking to take a firm adopted measure on how to address issues of anti-racism, and we're not getting that at the moment. And those need to be explicitly written in the professional capabilities framework and the standard of practice of what regulates social work practice in the UK. And as I said, they've got to be explicit. So it's not enough to say anti-oppressive or, you know, anti-discriminatory. We've got those already, but I think anti-racism has to be explicitly put in there. The need to promote anti-racism in the workplace, this is a collective responsibility. Again, it's not, onus is not just on people of color to be able to be pushing this agenda. It's really for everybody to be looking to do it together. We've talked about education, but again, all of these are just summarizing what we've sort of touched on before. There has to be, from social work education providers, a very clear anti-racist approach outlined in how, you know, they are sort of going to be educating students coming on to have those experiences within placement and within university curriculums as well.
And just on that, Pam, I think it's also about that university, that educational experience, and around what is the commitment of the, you know, learning establishment, the university, higher education institution, around their commitment to anti-racism as an institution, and in particular for us as social workers. What does that look like? What does that feel like?
Yeah. Again, just summarising the importance of allyship. So I'm just going to very quickly just read out what allyship is. Anti-racist allyship is understood by senior leaders, educators and practitioners to be vital in combating all manifestations of racism, educating, empowering and equipping allies to actively support colleagues from marginalised and minority groups in common places. And I think also this is where it's important to also talk about cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, cultural competence and cultural intelligence, because when that sort of helps you or gives you a framework to be able to understand, because I think that's basically what the lack of understanding that doesn't allow people to actually open up themselves to push these issues forward. So allyship actively promotes ways in which managers and staff can become allies or become better allies to support their Black and ethnic minority colleagues. Social work employers and educators demonstrate they are willing to keep listening and learning from people of color to instigate any meaningful change. So being open to have those conversations.
Thanks, Pam. I just want to pick up on something just around allyship, and something that I've been reflecting and learning more about around sort of performative allyship, and that place where it can appear, or you can appear, that you are challenging racism, but actually what you're doing is either maintaining the status quo inadvertently, or because you're not willing to give up that power, you're not willing to give up that privilege, and what you're doing is continuing to feed the existing situation, and no one's going anywhere. In fact, actually the actions that you're doing are to detriment to your Black and minority ethnic colleagues. So just want to make that point. That's something that I've been learning more about and trying to understand more about, because there's a danger that in being, thinking that you've achieved that status as an ally and that you've got it nailed, you know what you're doing, and actually it can be doing more harm than good. So just to make that point.
Yeah, very quickly I'll just go through the 7 A's of authentic allyship. So I think I'll start with the appetite. So the appetite is the need to, where it actually starts from, the need. I want to become an ally. How do I go about doing that? Ask questions, accept your privilege, acknowledge, and so openly acknowledge that the problem needs to be dealt with, apologize, express sympathy that racism is affecting certain people. Don't assume. Instead, ask constructive questions, ask questions if you're unsure about things. Because what very quickly on the issue of assuming is that without consultation, people tend to put strategies in place, and then you find that they don't work because you haven't actually consulted people that need to be consulted. So you've just gone and thought, okay, well, I think this this should address the issue, but it actually doesn't, and then you kind of just go through the same issues again, and then take action. So yeah, so that's me. I don't know if you two have any questions or any contributions that you'd like to talk about before we finish.
Well, just to say first and foremost, thank you very much, Pam. You've done a sterling job there of delivering what isn't really an easy presentation, because anti-racism isn't easy. It's complex, it's grey, it's subjective in areas. So you've done a really good job there, I think, of distilling some of the key issues and also outlining some of the solutions as well. So well done.
Thank you.
I suppose the only question that I have is, what in an ideal world, would you like to see from social work as a priority as far as anti-racism is concerned? If you had a magic wand, what would that be around these issues?
I think it's really acknowledging the urgency of implementing anti-racism within social work practice, and that is basically what's lacking at the moment. And it's lacking because there is an urgency from a national level. We haven't seen, yes, we do get the odd conversations every now and again, but sort of organizations have just been left to make their own decisions, and there's no decisive way forward with the conversations. And I think that for me is very worrying, because if we know what we know, which is racism is a real problem, it is a systemic problem which puts a lot of people, in a disadvantaged situation, then why isn't there that urgency to address it? And it just comes back to white privilege, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. So a kind of urgency you feel is needed from the key players and stakeholders.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, great. And what about yourself, Liz? Do you have any?
Oh, thanks. Sorry, Wayne, just went a bit robot there, but I've got you back.
That's all right. Oh, did I? I was just saying, right. Do you have any questions, Pam? Hopefully that wasn't too robot.
No, that's fine. And thank you very much, Pam, because the way that you delivered the presentation and obviously sharing from your personal experience, appreciate that again, as Wayne was saying, it's an incredibly sensitive area to be sharing how you feel about things personally and the impact that's had on you personally and in your career so far in social work. So thank you for that, and incredibly informative. I've learnt every time I hear a presentation about anti-racism, I'm learning something new, which for me is always, a positive experience. But I appreciate that's not always positive for everybody. But I think there's things that I need to take away in terms of my own practice now, particularly around the role of allyship, but also getting out of that habit of thinking small, micro. We've got to start thinking structure, what's going on around us all of the time, because it's all too easy to kind of ignore that. And that's when the awareness goes. So thank you for that presentation. I suppose to me, I'm thinking about, social work. We've got, huge social work workforce. We've got 96,000 social workers, that we've got. That's just in England. That's not even UK. That's in England, registered social workers. So what would you like to see us do as a profession? So I'm thinking about people at every single level. What is it that we need to do as a profession right now that would help you to think in 6 months' time that you don't feel the way that you've described now, that there's not been that much action, there hasn't been much happening? What is it that we all need to do collectively, thinking collectively as a profession about what we need to do?
I think collectively we need to be challenging the organisations that we work with collectively. It's like I said before, that one of the things that a lot of white people might say is, well, I've got Black friends, I've got Black social workers I work with. I've personally never done anything racist, so this is really not something I feel applies to me. But it applies to you because we are in an organization or within an institution or system that perpetrates racism. And so it's a collective, for this to be addressed, we need to collectively come together as a profession individually. And then when we do it individually, we have a bigger voice. And then when we have a bigger voice, then the people who need to be looking at putting all these things into action will start to listen.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. And it's exactly what you've been alluding to, and that we've been sort of talking about and describing. It's moving away from that personal interaction to thinking about the structure, the collective, the group, stronger voice, single voice, being very visible and vocal on these things as well, I think is what you're saying there as well, which is really, really important. So thank you, Pam, for your time today and for the presentation as well.